Welcome to Pardon for the Greatest Sinners, sermon by Jonathan Edwards, part 1 of 2, on Words of Wisdom. Jonathan Edwards was an acknowledged American philosophical theologian, born in 1703 into the family of notable Congregational ministers in Connecticut. In 1716, at the near age of 13, Edwards entered Yale University, where he became fascinated by the works of John Locke and Isaac Newton, and also took a keen interest in natural and mental philosophy. Jonathan Edwards' grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, also known as the Pope of the Connecticut Valley, was a prominent pastor of the Congregationalist Church in Northampton, Massachusetts, whose place the young theologian succeeded in 1725. Mr. Edwards had a big impact during the period of Great Awakening in America, or the Evangelical Revival, which was a series of Christian revivals that took place in the British American colonies and Europe. Jonathan Edwards wrote sermons and theological treatises that emphasized on absolute sovereignty, as well as the beauty and holiness of God. The theologian contemplated on the divine virtues as an imitation of the loveliness and benevolence of the Creator. According to the American philosopher, happiness comes from contemplating on God's creation and redemption, and true virtue is defined by the benevolence towards God and all beings, and not so much by self-love, love for family or nation. Today, Jonathan Edwards' life and works are being studied as a source combining religious intensity, intellectual thoroughness, and moral zest, with the belief that love is the source of all religions and faith, essential for our existence. We will now reflect on an excerpt from a sermon by Jonathan Edwards entitled Pardon for the Greatest Sinners, that invokes awakening of the soul to the reality of God's sovereignty and divine law, as well as infinite mercy, which is a protective wing from all our iniquities. Pardon for the greatest sinners. Psalm 25:11. For thy name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. It is evident by some passages in this psalm that when it was penned, it was a time of affliction and danger with David. This appears particularly by the 15th and following verses. Mine eyes are ever towards the Lord, for he shall pluck my feet out of the net. His distress makes him think of his sins, and leads him to confess them and to cry to God for pardon, as is suitable in a time of affliction. See verse 7. Remember not the sins of my youth, nor my transgressions. And verse 18. Look upon mine affliction and my pain, and forgive all my sins. It is observable in the text what arguments the psalmist makes use of in pleading for pardon. First, he pleads for pardon for God's name's sake. He has no expectation of pardon for the sake of any righteousness or worthiness of his for any good deeds he had done, or any compensation he had made for his sins. Though if man's righteousness could be just a plea, David would have had as much to plead as most. But he begs that God would do it for his own name's sake, for his own glory, for the glory of his own free grace, and for the honor of his own covenant faithfulness. Second, the psalmist pleads the greatness of his sins as an argument for mercy. He not only does not plead his own righteousness, or the smallness of his sins, he not only does not say, pardon mine iniquity, for I have done much good to counterbalance it, or pardon mine iniquity, for it is small, and thou hast no great reason to be angry with me. Mine iniquity is not so great that thou hast any just cause to remember it against me. Mine offence is not such, but thou mayest well enough overlook it. But on the contrary, he says, pardon mine iniquity, for it is great. He pleads the greatness of his sin and not the smallness of it. He enforces his prayer with this consideration, that his sins are very heinous. But how could he make this plea for pardon? Because the greater his iniquity was, the more need he had of pardon. It is as much as if he had said, "Pardon mine iniquity, for it is so great that I cannot bear the punishment. My sin is so great that I am in necessity of pardon. My case will be exceedingly miserable, unless thou be pleased to pardon me." He makes use of the greatness of his sin to enforce his plea for pardon, as a man would make use of the greatness of calamity in begging for relief. When a beggar begs for bread, he will plead the greatness of his poverty and necessity. When a man in distress cries for pity, what more suitable plea can be urged than the extremity of his case? And God allows such a plea as this, for he is moved to mercy towards us by nothing in us but the miserableness of our case. He does not pity sinners because they are worthy, but because they need his pity. Doctrine. If we truly come to God for mercy, the greatness of our sin will be no impediment to pardon. If it were an impediment, David would never have used it as a plea for pardon, as we find he does in the text. The following things are needful in order that we truly come to God for mercy. 1. That we should see our misery and be sensible of our need for mercy. They who are not sensible of their misery cannot truly look to God for mercy, for it is the very notion of divine mercy that is the goodness and grace of God to the miserable. Without misery in the object, there can be no exercise of mercy. To suppose mercy without supposing misery, or pity without calamity, is a contradiction. Therefore, men cannot look upon themselves as proper objects of mercy, unless they first know themselves to be miserable, and so, unless this be the case, it is impossible that they should come to God for mercy. They must be sensible that they are children of wrath, that the law is against them, and that they are exposed to the curse of it. They must be sensible that the guilt of sin makes them miserable creatures. Whatever temporal enjoyments they have, that they can be no other than miserable, undone creatures, so long as God is angry with them, that they are without strength and must perish, and that eternally, unless God helps them. They must see that their case is utterly desperate. For anything that anyone else can do for them, that they hang over the pit of eternal misery, and that they must necessarily drop into it, if God have not mercy on them. 2. They must be sensible that they are not worthy that God should have mercy on them. They who truly come to God for mercy come as beggars, and not as creditors. They come for mere mercy, for sovereign grace, and not for anything that is due. They must be sensible that it would be just with God to do as he hath threatened in his holy law. They who come to God for mercy in a right manner are not disposed to find fault with his severity, but they come in a sense of their own utter unworthiness, as with ropes about their necks and lying in the dust at the foot of mercy. 3. They must come to God for mercy in and through Jesus Christ alone. All their hope of mercy must be from the consideration of what he is, what he hath done, and what he hath suffered, and that there is no other name given under heaven among men whereby we can be saved, but that of Christ, that he is the Son of God, and the Saviour of the world, that his blood cleanses from all sin, and that he is so worthy that all sinners who are in him may well be pardoned and accepted. It is impossible that any should come to God for mercy and at the same time have no hope of mercy. Their coming to God for it implies that they have some hope of obtaining, otherwise they would not think it worth the while to come. But they that come in a right manner have all their hope through Christ, or from the consideration of his redemption and the sufficiency of it. If a person thus comes to God for mercy, the greatness of their sins will be no impediment to pardon. Let their sins be ever so many and great and aggravated, it will not make God in the least degree more backward to pardon them. This may be made evident by the following considerations. First, the mercy of God is as sufficient for the pardon of the greatest sins as for the least, and that because his mercy is infinite. That which is infinite is as much above what is great as it is above what is small. Thus, God being infinitely great, he is as much above kings as he is above beggars. He is as much above the highest angel as he is above the meanest worm. One finite measure does not come any nearer to the extent of what is infinite than another. So, the mercy of God being infinite, it must be as sufficient for the pardon of all sin as of one. If one of the least sins be not beyond the mercy of God, so neither are the greatest or 10,000 of them.